Great.
Well, I'm very excited to welcome Neil Howe, author of The Fourth Turning is Here, which is a fascinating, somewhat frightening, an extraordinary work of history, demography, sociology, and forecasting. A big thanks to our mutual friend, John Malden, for connecting us. He knew I'd been, like a lot of people, waiting years for this book to come out. So Neil, welcome.
Thank you, Bruce. It's wonderful to be here today and with all of your crowd. So,
well, I've had a lot of great authors, and a few have generated more excitement and more people telling me how much they enjoyed either the last book or lots of the books that you have written in the past. But I love the one that you and Bill Strauss wrote in 1997. It was prescient. And I've been waiting for this throughout the entire third turning. So I guess I'm glad the fourth turning is here. Let's start because there are plenty of uninitiated on the call. Let's start with, as you probably always do in these things, the big picture, how history is cyclical. It's overwhelmingly influenced by the interplay of generations, and maybe the way to do this is to go through the four archetypes, how they've applied, to point out the similarities. And let's start with everybody's favorite, the GI generation, the greatest generation, the hero archetype, and work our way to the anti-hero boomers, perhaps, to explain the big concept.
Yeah, we could do it that way. And actually, Bruce, that is actually the way Bill and I originally approached this. In the book that came out before the fourth turning, which was Generations, that came out in 1991. And at that time, the oldest millennials were only turning 8 or 9 years old, right? And we looked, the first birth year was 1982. The first of them were going to be high school graduates in the year 2000. So we gave them the name millennial, right? So that name took a while to catch on because we had Generation Y, right, which was the competitor during the 1990s. But in keeping with our thesis that every generation, no generation is an extension of the last generation. They always turn a corner. They are the correction on trends of the previous generation. Our thesis was millennials were not an extension of Gen Xers. They were fundamentally different. I mean, unlike Xers, these kids were special, protected, in the community, right? Very peer-oriented, more risk-averse. You go down the line, right? Achievement-oriented, wanting credentials in a way that Xers never, backward baseball cap didn't care about. But our vision went out, right? Gen Y just kind of petered out. Everyone could see eventually that the collective persona of this new generation was not an extension of Gen X. And that's an important lesson. That gets at what you actually asked me to start talking about, why these generations are different. Because in that first book, Bill and I went back all the way through American history, starting with the Puritan generation that came to America in the 1630s, the Great Migration, to the Boston colony. And we found that throughout American history, social generation, have been very different. They saw the events of their time very differently because of their age, location, and history was different, right? They might have taken part in a war that they saw one way, but the kids during the war, the children during the war, saw it very differently from their perspective. Their midlife, their parents saw it differently. And these differences aged with them. And there's a great, one of my favorite generational theorists, this was basically Jean Maltré. He wrote a book called Génération Sociale. This was back in the 1920s, social generations. He coined the term social generations. And he likened social generations to what he called tiles on a roof, right? Diagonal lines that are like this. And isn't that the case? If you have history, years on the x-axis, age on the y-axis, we all live a diagonal line, and a generation is a diagonal. Well, you look at those diagonals and you see that they have repeating archetypes. Certain generations always follow other generations, right? And so let's start with the GI generation. That's the one you started with. We call that the hero archetype for obvious reasons. given the name by Tom Brokaw, the greatest generation, for all the huge accomplishments of their lifetime. But hardly anyone knows how they started, Bruce. They started out as the little kids of the early 19th century. And one thing to understand about how they started out, which you understand the affinities with millennials in a second, is that the generation that came along before them as kids was the lost generation, who everyone decried as a hopelessly wild and violent generation, juvenile delinquency, crime, horrendous things that kids were doing. These kids were out on the streets. They were getting run over by streetcars. They were rolling cigars in cigar shops, for 10 hours a day, exploited child labor. And everyone said, we got to do better by these kids. And an important part of the progressive era, the presidencies of Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, and we've forgotten about this, but a very important part of the progressive era was the protection of children. And that was a huge part of their agenda. Child labor laws, vitamin pills for kids, protective playgrounds to keep kids out of danger, allowances for good behavior. This is when he started with allowances instead of having go off in the factories, right? Allowances for good behavior. We set up Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, Campfire Girls, 4-H clubs to put these kids in uniform. Remember Clinton talking about uniforms in the 1980s. You got to see kids in uniform, right? And a new attitude toward community. And by the time these kids were in college in the 1920s, they were just too young for World War I, right? And when they're kids in the 1920s, people got familiar with this new kind of protected, collectively confident, wholesome quality of these kids that were very different from the lost generation, the Fitzgerald, the gin fizz crowd of Zelda and F. Scott. And Hemingway, the kind of the brutalism of these people like Hemingway, no more the rum running, the barnstorming, all of this wild stuff that the Lost were doing. These kids wanted a planned and technocratic future, and they wanted a future with greater sense of national community. And after the Great Depression hit with the Black Thursday and the crash, they all voted for FDR by enormous majorities. Polls show that at the time in 1932 and 1936, they voted for FDR by over 80%, first-time voters. This was the first generation of African Americans to vote for the Democratic ticket, no longer the party of Abraham Lincoln, right? So this was the founding generation of the Democratic New Deal coalition, right? Came of age with emergency, came of age with depression, bread lines, banks being closed down. I mean, just a horrendous situation. Unemployment over 20%, and just this massive contraction of GDP. So they were the generation that later on, where they joined the WPA and the TBA. They were all in uniforms. They loved that. They always worked together. And people got familiar with them at the time as the junior citizens of that era. These are the young kids kind of banding together to do great things. And then come World War II, they were the ones, obviously, who mustered out. This generation was completely hit, really, from age 18 to 45. Everyone was expected to show up for some kind of service, and you would stay in service until the end of the war. There was no. You didn't get to go home after 6 months, or this wasn't like other wars, right? You were in for the duration. And they ended up conquering half the world, right? I mean, think of what that generation did. They came home with those great team building skills and that great sense of technocracy, and they build the suburbs with Levittown. They build the interstate highways. They build all the big infrastructure. The Army Corps of Engineers straightened all the rivers, all the dams, all the things that boomers later railed about, right? They built too much. And then later on, they built America. They took us to the moon. And by the time they entered old age, they became no longer junior citizens, but this was the first elders to be called senior citizens, right? And that's how we remember them.
Well, so yes, what's so fascinating to me about the turnings and the fact that there are 4 of them is your point and Bill's point, that every roughly 20 to 25 years, a new generation assumes primacy. And so the saeculum, all 4 generations combined, are roughly a one long human life. And what's fascinating to me is that the so-called hero archetype, the people who, the generation that fought that lived the Great Depression, that fought World War II, and that went on to build. If you go back 4 generations, you go to the hero archetype, that's when those are the people who were right there to deal with the Civil War. And if you go back 4 more, you get to the Revolutionary War. So what kind of blew me away was the idea that rather than events shaping people per se, you guys pointed out that, maybe what got us into World War II is also what got us into a Civil War, which is also what got us into a Revolutionary War, which is the generations in charge or the generations that were older. And obviously the fact that if you follow
it's what we call the generational constellation. And moving into a 4th turning, it's a constellation ready for action, ready particularly for community action, and for complete creative destruction of outer world institutional life. It is an order-seeking era. And let me kind of clarify that, the following. So the basic paradigm is the generations are shaped by history as children and young adults. And then about 2 phases of life later, entering elderhood as elder leaders, they then shape history, which then shapes young adults. I mean, you see how that works. It's a complete pattern, and that gives the periodicity. So people might wonder, why is it the length of a human life? Because it's the periodicities, because you have people coming of age into young adulthood and then entering elderhood as senior leaders. You have that yin and yang, right? You have that correction and compensation by generations 2 apart. Now, the way it works is very simple. Generations follow each other, certain types of generations. Every time we have a generation like boomers who are raised after a great crisis in comfort and prosperity, they always come of age attacking the institutions of their war veteran parents. That happens every time. And they have visions of utopia. They're strongly values-focused generation. And why do we need all of this social discipline? Why do we need all these rules? Why can't we just follow our heart, follow our values, right? And later on, they age into a very individualistic, values-focused generation later in life. They always give us the culture wars of that era in the 3rd turning. And then entering the crisis, they become the values fixated elders of that era. We sometimes call them the gray champions of that era. So that is one archetype. Another archetype is the nomad. We talked about the lost generation, Xer generation. They're always the children of the awakening. They're the throwaway kids. They're the kids who grow up to childless devil horror movies and Home Alone and no one really cares. I mean, people took pills not to have these kids. I mean, we kind of forget how they grew up. And their persona has been one of survivalism, right? Pragmatism. And we always find that in history. Always following the idealist generations, always comes the cynics, the pragmatists, and the people, the generations of metal and muscle to just get things done. Following the generation of Emerson and Thoreau and Walt Whitman and Abraham Lincoln, the generation of idealists, commune founders, feminists, religion founders, right? I mean, came the generation of George Armstrong Custer and Ulysses S. Grant, a generation of metal and muscle. They often got the name the Gilded Generation because they didn't have any aspirations to high culture or any great insight about life, but they got big, dirty jobs done, right? And often very violent jobs done when the country needed it done, right? When they were the age when they could make that happen. The corollary really of the archetype for the Gilded Generation would be the lost generation, who were they were in midlife during the Great Depression. No programs were targeted at them. I mean, we started Social Security for old people, and we had all these youth helping programs, but no one really cared about these people who lost their life savings. They were a greedy bunch, and they were a very pro-Republican generation. Interestingly enough, they leaned toward the Republican Party, just as the GI generation younger than them leaned toward the Democratic Party. And later on, they supplied us with the World War II winning generals. They were the Dwight Eisenhowers, the Omar Bradleys, the George Pattons, right? And after the war, they were entering elderhood and they asked for nothing for themselves. They didn't join AARP. In fact, in 1964, this was the generation most likely to vote for Goldwater. After Goldwater had promised to slash Social Security benefits, they still voted for him more than any younger age group. I point that out because later on, when AARP started to be filled with the ranks of the GI generation, whoa, no one ever dared to touch Social Security. The GIs knew they were entitled, right, to these new benefits. What a different persona, right? And what a different persona we see with Generation X, much more likely to vote Republican than the younger millennials, right, who are voting Democratic. In fact, by some measures now, Xers are even more likely to be Trump supporters than boomers. Very interesting, right? And how do you generate a kind of you might even say collectively negative self-image generation like Xers are? They're kind of a generation of, well, they don't make any pretenses about themselves. That's kind of with a part of the Gen X persona.
No offense, no offense taken.
And they like to think that they do their best things as individuals, right? I mean, they are. They don't really take to big kind of teamwork like things. They're a libertarian generation. They've been very slow. They find it hard to cooperate in large groups. And they have been very slow to enter into public life. This generation has been slower to assume posts as congressmen, senators, and governors than any other generation in American history. This archetype is always very slow to assume positions of civic leadership. We only had two lost generation presidents, remember? We only had Truman and Eisenhower. That was it. How many GI presidents did we have? I mean, they lasted forever. The first GI candidate for a major party office, I think, was Tom Dewey, running in 1944. The last one was George Bush Sr., running in 1996. Over 50 years of major party candidates in one generation. How many of the silent had? So let's look at the generation that were children during World War II, right? The silent, up to Joe Biden, had 0 presidents. Joe Biden is their first, and I think we can safely say their last, right? So it's interesting. The silent only had 4 candidacies for the presidency, right? They had Dukakis, they had John McCain, they had who got heavily defeated against Reagan in 1984. That
Mondale.
was Mondale, and they had Biden. Imagine only 4 candidacies. I think the GI generation had 20 major candidacies. That's another thing that we get into, and that's dominant and recessive generations in politics, which is another interesting feature.
Which interestingly, of course, makes sense and follows, just like society goes through periods that focus on more of the individual and less of the institution. And then a crisis causes people to say individualism is nice, but we need to survive. So we go and focus more on communities and communitarian and the group. And given those needs, that shapes generations. Let me ask you one thing, because something that's been on my mind is when I think about fourth turnings, we're obviously in one now. The last one crescendoed with World War II. Before that, it crescendoed with the Civil War. Before that, it was the American Revolutionary War. Before that, it was the Glorious Revolution, aka the British Civil War. You got the War of the Roses. You got the Spanish Armada period. Does a fourth turning ever not end with a war?
It doesn't always end with a war, but I will say every total war in American history has occurred during a fourth turning, and every fourth turning has had a total war. So the correspondence is pretty much dead on, right? Now people ask me, does it have to end that way? And look, I don't like to be a pessimist, so I say, well, maybe it doesn't have to, but I will say one thing. It has to encompass, it has to have at some point during the fourth turning, usually toward the end, a mood of total urgency, of the country, requiring the survival of their community, and which will result in the total public mobilization of the country and the complete reconstruction of much of its public institutional life, as we've seen in all the other fourth turnings, really giving birth to a new republic, almost a new collective definition of who we are. Now, does it require war? I actually have a chapter in the book, Bruce. I'm sure you noticed that it was fourth turning as a social process, and I actually talk a lot about William James. You know, the great pragmatist and philosopher. He was a pacifist during the Civil War. He was roughly a peer of Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., who obviously was not a pacifist. I think he was wounded at least 3 times during the Civil War. But William James made a famous speech at Stanford University in the early 1900s. I think it was 1906. And almost everyone has heard the title of that speech. It's called The Moral Equivalent of War. And he asked, you see, he went down all of the reasons why war was so important in forging nations and strengthening nations. In what other experience do people learn to actually forget their private lives and serve the commonweal, right? When do we actually participate in teams? When do we actually get to know who our neighbors are and actually cooperate in grand enterprise? He goes down these lists, and after a while, you're thinking, my God, you know, it really does sound like this is what wars are for. And then he sort of says, well, maybe we can invent a process which is simulated. Now, I'm not going to say William James is wrong. I will say that I think if you read his entire speech, he sounds less than convinced himself. But he asked at the end of his speech a very interesting question, and something that I think everyone, all of your audience, should reflect on. He asked the question, if I were to ask this audience, and remember he's speaking in 1906, so a lot of these people are still in the audience. He said, if I were to ask this audience, could you imagine America? Would you have preferred that America had never fought the Civil War? Kind of an interesting question to ask his audience, right? And then he immediately answers his own question. I can imagine that not one of you would have preferred we hadn't fought the Civil War, because after all, he said, none of you can imagine the sense of progress, unity, industrialization, political modernity. He goes through all the things that were generated by this, that coming out of the Civil War, right? And then he said, yeah, no, we couldn't imagine not doing it. But then he said, I'll ask you another question. Would anyone like to enter such a struggle anytime in the near future? And he said, no, I'm sure that almost none of you would. And then he called that a paradox in his speech, but it's very interesting. I find that it's very similar to a paradox in our personal lives. You think back, Bruce, a time in your own life, I don't know, God, what it was. You lost someone you loved, your business went down in flames. I mean, something terrible happened in your life that you had to get out of. And we've all had these experiences, right? And you ask most people, would you rather that had never happened? And most people will say on reflection, well, you know, actually, it made me a deeper person. It really actually developed some of the character I have today. Well, but then you ask him, would you like another event like that in the future? And almost everyone said, well, God, no, you know.
Well, and so I want to ask you about that, because you have a wonderfully hopeful chapter in there about first turnings and how, you know, after the crisis, there is the rebuilding and you get to a new high, and things so frequently are indeed improved that, while you're right, nobody wants to be in it again. People are glad that they got through it and they improved. But it felt to me when I was reading it that it's a little bit the perspective of the winners. And so what I wondered is, you know, whether it's the William James speech or otherwise, how many people in southern states would have said, yeah, I would have been psyched without the Civil War and all of the destruction? Or like, was there a high first turning in Germany and Japan after World War II? Or do you have to win to have a high?
No, you don't have to win to have a high, but obviously, so that's a great question. And I do answer it, I think, in that chapter. I basically say, no, it feels very differently when you're the loser, but many of the same attributes of the high, the new family orientation, the rise in fertility, the focus on building new institutions of infrastructure, and all of the South had that. You remember the development of the New South after the Civil War. Now it was a mood of defeat It was a mood of many of the intransigents, the lost cause and so on. We'll never give up with those Yankees and so on. But nonetheless, the South really joined the North in the overall social mood, even though it was a very different tenor. It wasn't so much the idea of victory. Interestingly enough, the North won, but it really didn't have this this mood of victory all that long. It was just sort of the satisfaction of being able to move on. The South realistically reconciled itself. Interestingly enough, Germany and Japan and Italy also reconciled themselves to the end of the World War II. They too had their civic generation, but they were to some extent discredited as opposed to the victors who were ennobled. And what that did lead to later on in the subsequent awakening is awakenings of unusual viciousness and violence. The 1960s and 70s, particularly the 70s in Germany, with the Baader Meinhof violence and so on, and in Italy, with they call these anni di piombi, the years of lead and the kneecappings and it's just horrible violence in Italy during that period was exceptional. I mean, yeah, the rest of Europe also had its Euro terrorism and a lot of its violence during those years. But it was exceptionally vicious in Italy and Germany. I think that was actually due to the discrediting of the hero generation in the eyes of the youth, because after all, they did not win, right? They were on the losing side of history. And don't forget, in the South, those are the periods of the enormous racial violence, often instigated by the younger whites, the peak of lynching and so on. These are often not pleasant. The awakenings in these societies are often not pleasant afterward. But the saeculum is a very durable, complex system. And it tends to revert, even in loss of a fourth turning, it tends to revert back to the same generational patterns. And we've seen that around the world, and we saw it in the American South.
So let me ask another question I had is, the periods go, you've got your crisis and then the kind of the rebuilding era and then the awakening and then the unraveling, and that leads back to another crisis. And prior to the crisis that we're in, which you start with the great financial collapse, so roughly 2008 to 2028, 2032, you get into, why there's no perfect periodicity in the math, but roughly,
right.
We're right in the heat of battle. But when I think of an unraveling, I definitely think of the last 10, 15 years for sure, although you have that in the crisis, but I get there's an overlap. But I also think of the 60s and the 70s, where, you have violence, you have, institutions being torn down and mistrusted and lies exposed. And I was, because that technically, per your analyses, is an awakening. And I'm trying to understand the difference between the 60s, 70s awakening and the 2010s to Trump era unraveling, and, how they're distinct.
Well, they were both traumatic. So, awakenings and crises are the two antipodes of the system, right? They're sort of the maximum daylight and the minimum daylight. You know what I mean? If you think of this seasonally, the summer and the winter. And some awakenings can get totally out of hand. I mean, the English Civil War, or the 30 Years' War, which is the height of the wars of religion, right, in the early 17th century, is an example of an awakening that truly got out of hand. But typically, the awakenings leave no lasting civic legacy, ever. I mean, what did the age of Andrew Jackson give us? Huge amount of Sturm und Drang, of all the romantic stuff. And they gave us, fictional heroes like Moby Dick, who a lot of people think was sort of a fictional personification of Andrew Jackson. But I mean, it gave us these incredible figures. But how did it durably change our civic life? Not at all. I mean, honestly, not at all, right? Civil War changed our civic life forever, right? And the Constitution and the American Revolution changed our civic life forever. It's the durability of the change. One thing that happens is that because the coming of age generation during the awakening is particularly interested in values, they're not terribly interested in outer world institutional change. What they want is just space to be themselves. They want less institutions. But what usually happens is the institutions continue to function fairly well. It's just they no longer really control people's lives nearly as well. So by the time you're at the end of the awakening, by the mid 1980s, with Ronald Reagan suddenly morning again in America, well, suddenly you have a president who really doesn't really want to govern society as much more willing to let culture go or to let these boomers do what the hell they want. If they want to, leave the middle class and do their own lives, some want to become hippies, some want to become hippies. If Nancy wants to bring the Beach Boys into the White House, we're fine with it. We're not going to try to control the culture anymore, as the GIs did earlier in the awakening. Do you understand what I mean? We become a more lightly governed America. And I think one thing you see by the unraveling in the late 1980s and 1990s is a mood where suddenly what seemed to be we all were chafing at during the awakening was these institutions which seemed to want to govern us so strictly because, coming out of World War II, we needed these really strong institutions. Suddenly, no, you can leave us alone. We'll be okay. Just give us markets. You know what I mean? Just let us do what we want to do, deregulate the economy, cut our taxes, whatever you do, let us be ourselves. And I think that the leitmotif of the 1990s was Francis Fukuyama's famous article and book, The End of History. The markets triumphed, individualism triumphed, governments would do their way, and we would all be self-actualizing individuals all over the world. And we'd just be sort of contracting with each other and fulfilling our own individual aspirations. Isn't that kind of both the boomer and Xer dream in their own way, right? But of course, history wouldn't allow that for long, right? We went into the winter season after that.
All right. So you probably get this question all the time, and I admit it's unfair. Nobody can predict specific events. But your best guess as to what triggers sort of the denouement here we're in a fourth turning. You're saying we've got to get to total mobilization before we kind of get past it and get beyond it. I realize it's a little bit like asking you if you could tell me the place I'm going to die so I don't go there. But as you see where we are now, before we it's got to be more of a crisis than it's felt like. What do you think is the thing? Is it foreign or domestic? Is it both? Again, we won't hold you to an exact prediction, but and the book goes through some of the possible alternatives. Highlight a few.
Well, yeah, I actually do that in some detail, as you recall. A long chapter on that. We talk about what kind of financial crisis we're likely to see. I often ask people, what's the second worst financial and economic crisis of the 20th century? And people sort of pause. And then I tell them it was 1937, right? Which is a horrible, the stock market down by over 50%, an enormous decline in GDP. We forget that, right? The volatility of that last fourth turning, and a lot of that volatility has yet to play out, right, in the 2020s, which will be a fourth turning decade. But you're right, Bruce. I often like to say, look, I'm interested in the tides, not the waves. I can time the tides. I can't time the waves. If you're asking me which wave will knock out the lighthouse, I can't tell you that, but I can tell you when the tide will rise and fall, and I know kind of what period the lighthouse is likely to be hit, right? In the book, I talk about conflict. Organized conflict always comes at the climax of a fourth turning, because so what happens is that during the unraveling, right, we all are kind of disaggregated individuals, right? Civic life has sort of ebbed. And then we go into the fourth turning. You have to remember, in the second turning, what do we want? We want less orders. Society is supplying too much order. We want less. The demand for order declines. And of course, particularly the coming of age youth say, I don't want all this. I don't want all these strictures. I don't want all these rules. Fewer of them, please. And finally, that's what happens. We have fewer rules, right? So we go through a process of reducing the supply of order because there's less demand for order. In the fourth turning, it's the opposite, right? we start out with the supply of no order, but then society, again, with the coming of age generation, this time millennials at the cutting edge, right? Saying, no, we want more order. It's a very different kind of mood, right? Because that's why we see populism and authoritarianism around the world. These are electorates who want more order, not less, right? From elites that are not giving the order. They're not providing those social safety nets. They're not providing those assurances, right? Yeah, the system of liberal democracy works really well for those elites, but it's not working for us, which is why coming of age adults around the world, not just in millennials in the United States, are losing faith in democracy. And I talk a lot about that. I go through the opinion polls on that. And I think that's what's going to shape the mood and why it leads to conflict is that what happens is people start to find order, people start aggregating themselves into new groups. They start mobilizing into groups on their own, right? And right now it's blue zone versus red zone. I mean, those are the tribes we now have. Back in the 1930s, it was fascist versus communists. I mean, that was what it was back then. We all know what it was during the Civil War. You know, you can go back and form your own crowds, form your own color coordinated codes for each one. But this is what we see. And eventually it requires conflict. Now, will it be internal or external? Well, I will say two things. First of all, neither of these possibilities were on a radar screen 10 years ago. And that's what I want to point out. When we're going into the fourth turning, we didn't even do polls on Civil War. It considered that far beyond anyone's conceivable thinking, right? Today, roughly half of Americans think it's likely in the near future, right? As for great power conflict, well, look, I mean, it's obvious, right? We have a major land war in Europe, and we see this full court press going on in the Western Pacific. You know about it as much as I do. We write about it all the time. We've seen all the prognostications of admirals and generals who are actually in charge of that area. I'd say America's pretty alarmed right now, right? And where the world is leading. And so I think what it might be has become much clearer to us now. When Bill and I were writing the fourth turning, it was back in 1997. Well, of course we didn't have any idea. I mean, we couldn't have foreseen the red zone, blue zone. We couldn't have foreseen the rise of Trump, the transformation of the Republican Party in particular into a populist party, which I believe is the next political realignment, by the way. Political realignments, by the way, always occur in awakening and crisis eras, all the way back through American history. I mean, this is one of the ways in which the turnings perfectly replicate other patterns of social change that people have seen. We saw our last realignment in the 1970s, particularly with the Republican takeover of the South. And now it's the populist takeover of the Republican Party and the increasing polarization of parties by education, rather than any notion of social class that we used to hold, or geography, which we used to hold. But this increasing separation of America into these two zones, increasingly separated by county and state, right? We see that is very dangerous. Now you ask me which is most likely, right? And I say, this is the amazing thing. I've looked back closely in all these turnings, and you can, read my discussion of it in the book. It is surprisingly indeterminate at a surprisingly late stage of the fourth turning, which way it will break. I mean, if you had asked an American, Bruce, I'll just imaginary, right? If you had asked an American in 1937, right, when the economy was tanking again, and by the way, even by 1940, it wasn't until 1940 that bond yields reached their all-time low. We still had deflation. I mean, we were still in the Great Depression, despite years and years of New Deal policies. But if you had asked an American in 1937, you had first told them, there's going to be a huge war in our not too distant future. What's it going to be about? I think most Americans would have said, well, clearly it's going to have to be communists and fascists in America. I mean, we had Sinclair Lewis writing "It Can't Happen Here." We still had, well, Huey Long had just been assassinated, but we still had other candidates, you know, running around. That's what they would have said. And remember, at that time, young adults were still filling out the Oxford Pledge. If asked by my government to serve in war, I will refuse. You know, I will not. Everyone is remembering World War I. You know what horrible thing that was, and no one wanted to serve again. So the youth at that time, the greatest generation, was still resolutely pacifist. A lot of them, their best and brightest, were communists. And anyone actually goes and watches the movie Oppenheimer, will actually get a little view into that world, right? Many of these, what we like to call the greatest generation, were card-carrying commies. I hate to say it, but they had to live down their own youth, right? Which is that say anything you want about millennials, but very few millennials are dedicated to actually, bringing down American capitalism. They're not sworn to the Comintern in Moscow.
Yeah.
But that was the division in America at the time. But Bruce, the reason I'm bringing all this up is we so often see history in retrospect. We know how it all turns out, so we read the present back into the past. We don't look at ourselves how it looked to them at the time, right? How the future, how unknown it was to them at the time.
All right, so it's a good lead into the last question I have, and I would note for all of our attendees, we bought 100 copies. So the first 100 folks, we'll send a link out like we always do, and the first 100 folks who fill out their address will get books mailed to them. And happily, we crushed 100 attendees. We got to 200. So other people, it's called Amazon. It's a great place to get books. I'm not sure it's a beach read for people like me and you, Neil. Other people might want to get into, a little bit more romance. There's no romance in the book. That's okay. I love the book. Here's my last question. You described a little bit like the tides. There is some fatalism where ultimately society can't avoid the fourth turning, but we can prepare. And so I'm interested in how you prepare. And we've got, community leaders like Steve Case. We got business leaders on. We've got a lot of folks, both as individuals and as leaders. How should one prepare for a fourth turning that has yet to crescendo?
In the epilogue, which is short, I think the epilogue is only 8 pages, 10 pages, not very long. But I tell the story of the Navajo sand painters, and I tell the story of the Bhagavad Gita, and I say that traditional cultures that believe in cycles, believe in social roles, always assume that whatever we're going through, we've been through before. Actually, that approach empowers us. It's not fatalism, it doesn't weaken us. It empowers us because it means that we have a role that we can do well or badly. And actually, I think that puts agency into our hands, right? If we realize that whatever generation you belong to now, you have a role. You could do it well or badly. And that will make all the difference in making sure this comes out well. Fourth turning does not guarantee good outcomes. America's usually ended fourth turnings pretty well. Many other countries of the world have gone through fourth turnings and ended very badly, right? So that, I think, kind of empowers us. And I would say the vision to see the future even when others don't agree with you. Let me just give you an example. And this was due to a couple of Southern congressmen back in 1940, and as well as FDR and just a few far-sighted people who agreed to put through Congress the Two Navy Act. I believe it was in July of 1940. The largest naval appropriations ever. As a share of our budget, basically nearly doubled the size of the Navy. It started laying the keels of the Iowa class battleships, the Essex class aircraft carriers, and more than 100 destroyers. I mean, it was an incredible thing. If we had not done that at that time, right, after Pearl Harbor, by the time we got to 1943, we were down to like one flat top by the Guadalcanal. I mean, I think it was the Saratoga. We were clinging by our fingernails, right? Suddenly these huge capital ships started arriving, right, in the summer of 1943, giving us the ability to truly move on Japan. Where would we have been without that early decision? Or another great one, this actually is just actually a similar example. This was Athens after the Battle of Marathon. You know, the Persians came once. Well, the Athenians maybe were lucky. They beat them on the beach. The Athenians go back home and they say, okay, Persians are gone. And Themistocles, who was the ruler of Athens at the time, said, well, I think they'll probably be back. And he said, you know, we just opened this new mine that they're mining a lot of gold near Athens. We got a little revenue coming in. Most of the Athenians said, no, I think we should just give ourselves tax cuts. You know what I mean? We got all this new revenue. The city said, no, I'll tell you what we do about all this this gold revenue. We build a fleet. We build 100 ships. Well, they did. Now, if they hadn't built it, if the cities hadn't foreseen that, they couldn't have made a stand at Salamis. Athens may have been forever wiped off the map by Xerxes. But you see what I'm getting at? Decisions made at when the future seems unclear because you have an idea of where history is going can make all the difference. And I tell that to community leaders. I tell that to local leaders. I tell that to national leaders. It's very important that we orient ourselves, not because you're trying to ensure that the worst happens, but you're preparing, right? You're preparing.
So you're building ships.
Well, you know, ships actually are on the agenda, aren't they, today in terms of policy? You know, looking again at the Pacific. But really, I'm making a much broader point, obviously. I'm making a point that some things really need to be done in advance. And when they come online, are you forever thankful that you did them? I'll make another point too, Bruce, that I think is really important. And that is, and this is really one of the things that's very positive about the fourth turning. If you ask most people, when should we actually make decisive, fundamental rethink of public policy and the institutions by which, you know, federal government, state government, by which we actually implement public policy, reprioritize everything, start from scratch. When should you do it? Most people would say, well, okay, let's do it on a sunny day when we've got budget surpluses, no recession on the horizon, you know, because then we have all the resources and we're going to focus on it. That may be what we think would be the best moment. History says that's never when we do it. We always do it, to the contrary, on a stormy night when our backs are against the wall and the very near-term survival of our nation is at stake. That's when we make the big decisions. The 1780s was one of the most disastrous decades for standard of living in American history. The standard of living fall was even greater than the 1930s. It was horrible. I mean, America was falling apart. The states were completely independent. They were likely to get reacquired by Spain and England and France piecemeal. And what did we do? We banded together and we forged a new constitution. Look at the Civil War, what we did. I mean, we implemented a new income tax. We regulated the national banks for the first time. We did the Transcontinental Railroad. We had college, the state college. We go on and on. We say nothing of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, Bruce. But think about that. Congress did that while often wondering whether the Capitol itself might be attacked, right? But you go through, correct, and you see how little we do during times of peace and prosperity and how much we do during times of crisis. It really does make you think, right, a little bit on who we are as a species, right, and how we actually do respond to stress. And we have so much more capabilities than we think we do at a time of crisis than we're likely to ever imagine during a time of peace without stress.
It's a great note to end on. Neil, thank you for your generosity of time. Thanks for writing the book. Thanks to everybody for attending. You'll enjoy it. It's a great read. It's an important read. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce.